In this fast-paced world where everything moves quickly and we're on to the next thing before we finish what we're doing, we might stop a moment and reflect on our thoughts and how they echo through time. Hi, I'm Beth Bonness, host of the Thought Echoes podcast, where we explore how to engage with our thoughts and appreciate their entanglements with our pasts, our futures, and with those we love and interact with the most. In this episode, I had an interesting conversation with Maggie Jackson, award-winning author and journalist. Although her book Distracted was originally written in 2008 and re-released a decade later, I didn't learn about it until I interviewed Maggie last year for her book Uncertain. It took me almost a year to get around to reading it, but the message still resonates today. I'd say there's a growing urgency for us to learn more about what attention is and how it is being hijacked, so we can reclaim where we choose to place that precious personal resource. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, Maggie. It's so good to see you again. And we've got the heat wave on the East Coast, and the West Coast is kind of not so much right now, but I think it's going to be coming our way. So it's good to see you again. As I mentioned, you're the only person I've had on the podcast twice because of all the books that you've written. So can you tell us about how you came to write Distracted?
Sure. Well, I was one of the first work-life balance columnists in the United States. And so I was writing a lot about family life and, how particularly we were living in this frenzied kind of world and schedules were crazy, et cetera. I was writing all about that, but technology became more and more a part of the equation. And as well, I was really interested in how we could adapt to technology. I started thinking about this book, Distracted, just a year after the first smartphone came out. And so it was really early days, but I was seeing the signs that this explosion of devices was really changing how we relate and how we think and etc. So the first edition of my book came out way back in 2008. And then the 10th anniversary edition came out in 2018, fully updated. Again, it was an extension of my work at the time. But I literally got to the exact topic by sitting in the library and looking at historical research about how what happened when the telegraph came in and the bicycle and the train and the car. And I was looking for hints and clues in the past to how we could again cope with all these changes in our lives due to technology. And I realized, bingo, the issue was actually attention. The attention is so little talked about, how we attend, and distraction is such a basically effect of the technology in our world, as well as other trends like mobility and globalization, etc. But I finally, bingo, literally had a light bulb moment and thought, wow, I want to write a book about attention.
And when I interviewed the first time for Uncertainty, and we talked about what the origin of that was, you had said you were initially interested in how we think. And in the process of kind of exploring that, you came to this uncertainty topic as the umbrella for how you were going to write about that. And so that's why I was curious how Distracted, kind of how it came
Yeah,
uncertain.
yeah. And
And go ahead.
yes, yes, you're asking about how, um, how I came to write about uncertain as well, how that
Mhm.
followed on distracted.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So basically, Distracted is the second in a trilogy of books. My first book was about the changing nature of home in the digital age. Again, that grew out of my, journalism work. And then after I finished Distracted, I really wanted to write a book about thinking in the digital age, thinking when life is so stressed and frenzied and fragmented and speedy and etc. And that question. This led me to think about, to really discover that uncertainty is not what we think of it as. It's not weakness and inertia. Actually, a whole lot of new science shows that uncertainty drives our uncertainty, our unsureness actually drives curiosity, open-mindedness, resilience, adaptability. So these books all, one led to the other, and they're all books about aspects of humanity that are woven into the fabric of our lives and yet very poorly misunderstood. Attention, or very poorly understood. Attention, home, uncertainty. These are all, issues, concepts, parts of life that we should understand a lot better than we do. And they're all really important for how we thrive, how we as humans thrive. And yet, all of these issues, how to have a home, how to be attentive, how to be uh, unsure in positive, skillful ways. These are all things we don't teach our kids and we don't study in school, and we don't even spend a lot of time thinking about practicing. So that's the sort of genesis of all these books.
And I love that. And when I had, after I interviewed you the first time, and I was mentioning it to my sister who's a teacher, and she knew your book, Distracted. And so I thought, oh, that sounds perfect. Thinking you had written it like last year. I mean, because we're so distracted. And so I put it on my list, and it took until after the beginning of the year. And I thought, as I was reading it, even the original copy as opposed to the updated copies, it was so timely. Yes, the statistics would change because more time had gone by, but it seemed even more prescient to be able to talk about that now. So I couldn't put it down. So
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I really appreciated going through it. When since I'm fascinated with the ripple effect of our thoughts and our inability to be able to focus our intention has become a habit. This whole concept about multitasking is a good thing, when in reality, and I think most people know that that's not the case anymore, but I still think that we can all use reminders in terms of what being distracted does to us. And so, in terms of what your research found, can you talk about how, the habit of being distracted has kind of had a negative effect on us?
Right. Yeah. And I think it's also important, since I mentioned history and technology throughout, the last few hundred years, it's important to mention that I think one of the things that technology does to us is change our experiences of time and space. So the idea that we rose with the sun, well, we're over that. That religious holidays used to be designated and that's when you rested. And now it seems with, the early technologies, there's a sort of a given now. It's normalized that we can do two things at once. That seems like the ticket to efficiency. It's not just that our technology, like a camera, allows us to stop and preserve a moment, but now we really actually think that we can splice time. And we also live in a world where space and place are kind of collapsed. Where speed it's normal to fly across the globe. All of that lends itself to this idea that distraction is not just being pulled to something secondary. That's one of the definitions in the dictionary. You're pulled away by something, an interruption, or your boss comes to the door, or the TV is on, etc. But it's also very much a kind of fragmentation, as in we're layering and splicing time and events and things like that. So that really has a huge effect on our brains and how we operate. You mentioned multitasking. Multitasking is not just doing two things in parallel. In fact, that's mostly impossible for the human brain. Basically, we're constantly what's called task switching. And when that happens, when we're constantly, watching TV and trying to catch up on email with our laptop, or people have their phones out at the restaurant table, or even when you're in the middle of a great deep philosophical discussion with your kids, a wonderful moment like that, people pull out their phone and Google something that breaks up and fragments this kind of what I call the the moment of the presence of the moment. And what happens in your brain there is that when you're multitasking, you're switching back and forth, and your brain can't really keep up with these things. Even something as simple as adding and dividing. If you're constantly trying to do two things at once, your brain has to ratchet up and understand the rules of engagement for talking or cooking or dividing something in mathematics. And then it has to quickly swivel around and ratchet up the rules or the routines or the rituals for, again, something else, for, driving the car if you're also talking, or, these sorts of, we try to live in these two different worlds, and our brain can't keep up. So what happens is your brain uses networks of the brain when you're multitasking related to automaticity, automatic behavior. That's why you can't learn as well. You can't remember as well when you're multitasking. In fact, professors have told me that when kids, now students, college students or younger students, multitask their way through the psychology 101, for instance, by being on their laptops and etc., they actually return in the spring and it's as if they hadn't even taken the fall term. That's how bad the effect is on our memory. Other issues related to multitasking are having trouble with discerning what's important. One of the classic findings from people who multitask a lot is that they have a lot of trouble discerning what's important in their environment. They're just constantly jumping at things. They're just, the alarm bells sound if something's happening, but they're not really processing whether it's important to, jump and do this. It leads to snap judgment, etc. So there are uh, huge impacts on our lives from living this constant diet of distraction. And then the other thing I think, which is really related to thought and our ability to think and how we live in a thinking way, which as your podcast highlights, is that this constant outward attention, which is both device oriented but also just occurs when we're speeding through life, the constant focusing outward actually erodes our inner life. Now, how is that? Because the brain networks related to reacting to something in our environment, maybe a new email that comes in, or something is happening, a new Instagram post on our phone or whatever. We're constantly looking outward, and when we're doing that, the brain networks related to inner thinking, whether it's daydreaming or following a trail of thought, that toggles down. So you can't multitask paying attention to the world and having an inner life. We all know that. We all can sense how even something like a creative daydream, what am I going to write in this article or chapter, or what am I going to say at my toast at my daughter's wedding? You have a big family event coming up.
Yep,
These
exactly.
sorts of inner worlds that we inhabit necessitate a kind of what's called decoupling from the world. Yeah, you can still hear what, if someone comes to the door, etc. But we really do have to go within in order to have an inner life, and that's what is eroded. I remember being at the University of Maryland, and I was taking some time to study students who were going through a digital detox, just 24 hours without media. It was incredible. Some of them said, I've never heard birds singing on campus before. And some of them said, wow, I visited a sick friend and it was so powerful to be with them instead of just texting. And then one student in a journalism class said, well, there was this little voice in my head. And the teacher was kind of puzzled, and even the other students were kind of puzzled. It turns out he, after turning off all the devices, was able to listen to his inner thinking. And he really was so disconnected from that he didn't even know what it was at first. That's huge. And I could go on and on. The distraction as well, this kind of fragmentation erodes slow thinking. Daniel Kahneman made famous the difference between slow and fast thinking. Our technologies really speak to this kind of reactive heuristic gut thinking. In other words, the first thought that comes to mind is based on what you already know. In order to really be creative, be innovative, be reflective, be a deep problem solving person, you need to have the time and the will to construct, to follow a trail of thought. We can only do this when we have the time and space to devote to, the questions and the puzzles and even the frustration of all that entails. And so distraction really goes hand in hand with very cursory thinking, whereas being skillful at our attention goes hand in hand with deeper thinking when we need to. We don't always need to, solve big problems, but when we need to, the attention is the vehicle that allows us to practice that kind of deep thinking.
One of the stories that you elaborate in the book, and I meant to tag it before we started, but I think it was around the Posner test and talking about the different the executive part of attention. And so can you talk about those? I think there were 3 different layers, one that kind of does the dispatching, and then there are other things that get triggered. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Well, it's our average, daily understanding of attention is really pretty small. And it turns out that, and actually science has only recently begun to unpack what attention is. It seems so amorphous. How does it work? How do our brains basically create and operate this beautiful miracle of paying attention? Well, it turns out there are 3 different networks in the brain. So there are 3 kinds of attention, essentially. One is awareness, kind of wakefulness. There are different brain networks that allow us to be aware of the world around us. Second is called alerting. Second is orienting. That's kind of like the flashlight of the mind. You orient to something when there's a noise in the background. Now, I like to say to audiences when I'm giving a lecture, you can be focusing on me and yet be half asleep. Those are 2 different but related types of attention, the wakefulness of alerting and the the focus of orienting. And then there's the executive attention networks that are highly related. It's kind of like the symphony conductor of our attention. That allows us to make choices and basically steer our thoughts in a certain direction. A lot of what's called executive function skills, which has gotten a lot of press, in child development, related to working memory or, inhibiting distractions, etc. Those are all attentional skills. Attention is absolutely extraordinarily important for how we operate in the world. And it's really useful to know that there are these 3 different kinds. So, meditation might help us become more focused and less able to be, hijacked by distractions. But we also need to take care of ourselves and get enough sleep so we can be alert to the world around us. So these all operate in tandem, and yet they're 3 different kinds.
And I think breaking it down that way, the multitasking, and I understand that we really can't do that. We call it that, which is really we're context switching. And there's statistics about something like 20 minutes once, if you're deep in thought on some project or whatever you're working on, and then there's an interruption, it can take you like up to 15, 20 minutes to get back to the space you were at, which is good to know for you personally, that when you're working on something that is important and you don't want to have that you really do need to carve out some quiet, uninterruptible time, if at all possible. When you had mentioned with students, and so I'm thinking of, I've got a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old granddaughter. And so watching, that exploring life and starting to walk and all the attention, her world is changing and what must be going through her brain. And then looking at her 4-year-old sister who's got better attention. But when she really gets into some role-playing game or whatnot, rather than what's the next thing and all the questions that kids can ask, I really now want to protect that space. It's like, yeah, I wanted you to go help with folding the wash to put your clothes away, and that'd be a fun activity to do with me. But it seems so precious that she can spend that amount of time on whatever she's doing, coloring or whatever play acting that she's doing, that I want to preserve that now for her. So it's interesting, looking at the different ages of my kids in terms of who's distracted, who's the one who has the phone out, or how there are times with my husband where you're talking and I think he's not listening to me, but he's trying to Google something to check. So he's engaged in the conversation, but in a way that takes him out of the conversation. And I have to have myself, I'll be journaling something in a quiet morning, and I'll sometimes write, resist the urge to go fact check that, because if I do, something will come up on my phone, and 20 minutes later, I've read email and I've done everything but what I was going to do. And then I'm like, where was I? Um,
Right, right. A great metaphor is sometimes we walk into a room and we forget what we're there for. Well, that's just a kind of a glitch in our working memory, and maybe we had other things to think about that were more important. So distraction can function productively. But think of our world today as if you walked into a room, and what if everything in the room was hopping and jumping and calling out your attention and leaping at you, and how could you possibly remember what you had walked into the room for? We live in this world of hyperlinks and speed and so many different distractions. And again, I think one of the most important things to remember is that this is becoming normalized. It used to be shocking when we saw a TV with the scroll on it. Remember CNN? Oh my gosh, look at that.
right.
And we didn't really think of it as being a distraction, although studies have shown that you don't remember the news as well if there's a crawl at the bottom of the screen. And these sorts of changes to our universe and to our environment are seen as completely normal. And, even the number of frames per second in movies has ratcheted up enormously, as we can imagine. When we watch an old movie, they seem so slow. But I think it's really important. And historically, as sort of a comparison, nobody thinks about what the electric light bulb does to our world. Well, it obviously changed everything about sleep and time and what jobs could be done and etc. But I think while we're still in the early stages of at least many of these technologies, it's important to keep those fresh eyes on what's going on and kind of constantly ask ourselves, well, is this good and to what degree? And then, as you do, prompt yourself to guard the focus that you want, for calibrate it to whatever you want, but guard the focus, because you're then guarding your skill in doing so. These are kind of, as all brain types of thinking are often practice oriented, they can atrophy. In fact, scientists are quite worried about this constant checking of devices by young people, because they're worried that the networks related to inner life, particularly the default mode, sometimes called the imagination network, isn't getting practice. And so we might not be able to utilize these types of thinking, and maybe value them less when we're giving ourselves over to this, environments that hijack us. It's really important. So one of the tips I like to tell people is, set boundaries of time and space. Maybe you want to make a tech-free dinner hour when the family's around. And studies show that family members, especially mothers, actually feel depressed and isolated because their kids are so often on devices. So the kids are distracted from, or aren't really even learning that kind of intense and important human attentional capability. So I think setting boundaries of time, like, 6 to 7, no tech at the dinner table, or space. Put your cell phone. Some companies actually, at least they used to, make it mandatory for salespeople who are driving around a lot to have put the cell phone in the trunk, so that they would actually, because the liability is so bad and so many accidents are related to distraction. And so I think that's, that's kind of making a boundary of space.
Mhm.
When I'm trying to concentrate, try to put my cell phone in another room, in a bag, in a closet, and, even just zipping it into a bag in the same room. All of these things help set it apart and then allow you to not worry about what's coming at you.
Mm. There, so many things crossed my mind as you were talking. One is the earlier you mentioned how we often go after the first solution, or it's like quick, if and as you gain more experience, you can do that more than you could when you were in your 20s. That makes sense. But allowing, it's like brainstorming, the first couple of ideas might be good, but if you kind of have everybody hang on and go to 10, there may be something that you never would have given enough airspace to find. And so doing that periodically is good. Yet there are also books like Blink, which is now a couple decades old, where it was trying to get you to trust your gut, because when you're in management, you've got so many decisions to make. And so instead of lamenting over, am I making the right decision? It was like, trust your instincts from your experience and move on and keep track of whether that really was a good decision that you make. So we've got these tools, this the phones and the computers that can help us. But it's also, there's been research done with AI too, is that we are outsourcing and Googling to get an answer and it doesn't stick. It's a little bit like memorizing statistics for a text the test the next day, and you really aren't going to remember them later because you really didn't engage with the material. So each of us having to decide, when should I use, little things like, I've got to go to the store. So am I going to put that into a grocery list so I'm not using any cycles, worrying about, was it apples and blueberries and the 6-pack of beer or the wine? And so I can concentrate on something, or am I weakening my memory because I'm not using that as a
Mhm.
way to remember things? So I think each of us have to look at periodically how we're using it, and is it helping us or is it not? So you had talked about one of the tips. What other tips do you have for people? And I think the first question is, are people aware? So maybe before jumping into the tips, is there some suggestion you can have for people to kind of reflect on how they're spending their time and noticing the difference between, as you mentioned, if you have a dinner where there's no technology, or a day. There used to be, Fridays used to be no meeting day. And I worked in a company that added that crawler to the CNN thing. So I was cringing a little bit because I remember that. And it's like, no, I can't look at that and follow what the news is. So anyways, back to, what suggestions might you have for people to develop an awareness to how distracted they might be so that they can make some choices?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think a lot of people track their screen time, and that might be some kind of barometer of how much you're, wedded to your to devices, which are, basically distracting, teaching you kinds of forms of distraction. So that's sort of one easy way to think about it. I mean, I would love to say that we are surrounded by technologies that promote contemplation and focus, but we aren't until technologies are, better at speaking to the other side of ourselves. Then I think we need time off from them. And obviously I mean, people spend 150 times a day checking their phone. That's definitely is sort of like training the brain to be distracted. I think it's also, if you feel as though you have memory issues, you are feeling like you can't remember as well. The context of trauma, like COVID, even not just having COVID, but being in a traumatized society will undermine your memory. But still take a look at how, the distraction that you're facing might be splicing up your day so much so that you can't build those deep long-term memories. It takes time. And I think one really important kind of footnote to memory and distraction is that um, when you're learning something that's contradictory to what you already know, it could be someone's opinion that you disagree with. Basically, that kind of information takes more time to settle into the mind. The mind kind of curates and sifts and sorts and abstracts and synopsizes, and it just takes more time. If you're learning something that kind of you already know, like easy French vocabulary words, if you already speak French, well, then you're going to remember it, and etc. So, be aware that maybe sometimes pausing, letting things sink in, allowing ourselves to be, away from the distracting devices have two benefits. One is you'll remember things better, but you'll also remember things that challenge you. I think that actually could be a nifty little suggestion for helping us with polarization. So I think that, and also, studies show that in family life, people who use technology around children are basically feel like the experience, say a trip to a museum, is less enjoyable. So when studies show that interruptions cause stress and frustration, that splintering our focus causes situations, events, family dinners, trip to the museum with the kids to be less enjoyable. Well, maybe some of the stress and frustration you are experiencing in life today has to do with not having enough time for that, full focus that allows you to think deeply, or that even that cognitive daydreaming, asking what if questions. It's just really important to allow ourselves to have these slow moments to cope with all that we're coping with today, and then as well know how to be on our toes and kind of multitask in ways that are skillful and selective and deliberative, not just as a steady diet of the minds.
That is very good advice. And so for anyone who feels distracted, wanting to get a copy of the book and have some slow time, mine is so marked up in terms of gems that are in there. And I found myself wanting to get to the next gem and going, no, this was a good one, especially if you read it over a couple times, not because I was distracted, but because it resonated, either because it was new or a different angle. It's like that to me was a clue to go for a walk or to do something and let my subconscious figure out how it was going to parse it and let it kind of work its way into how I was going to approach something. So thank you very much for taking the time. Always a delight. I'll put all the contact information for all the good work that you're doing in the book and other books with Uncertain. And it was a pleasure talking with
Thank
you
you.
again. So maybe we should put on our calendar next year, 2026. There's going to be some book you do
I don't
for the
know. I don't
next
know.
year.
But and also just for your listeners, the second edition of the Distracted book is called the subtitle is Reclaiming Our Focus in a World of Lost Attention. So that's the one to look for. And also you can find a lot of resources on my website. Just Google Maggie Jackson Distracted or Maggie Jackson Uncertain, the name of the third book, or just Maggie Jackson, and you'll find me. And there are lots of resources on both topics.
So it was a delight. Thank you. And
Thank you.
hopefully you stay cool on the East Coast.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Beth. Okay,
Bye.
take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of the Thought Echoes podcast, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend. It helps get the word out. Until next time, keep exploring the echoes that shape your world.